Hello everyone, Books with Banks back again, and back today to talk about more Shakespeare. Again, while his works aren't all strictly fantasy, nor do they read like much of what else I talk about on my channel, I do love Shakespeare, and I feel like there are enough threads of connectivity between the Shakespearean and epic fantasy tropes and themes and such to reasonably include videos about Shakespeare works in or on the same channel where I talk about fantasy. Anyway, here we go. We're talking about today, and if you clicked on the video, I guess you know already. But we're talking about some of my favorites of Shakespeare's plays, the histories, and specifically, I would like to rank the 10 main histories from my least favorite to my most favorite. Of course, totally subjective. I will say I will be spoiling elements of these plays, but they're historical, or they're based on historical events. I'm not going to be going through every single thing that happens in their plots, but yeah, just, fair warning. If you ever want to go into any of these plays totally blind, I don't think that's necessary. In fact, in some cases, I think it can help a little bit to go in knowing just a little bit more about what you're getting yourself into. Anyway, before we get to the ranking, there's a few things I need to kind of clarify here. Now, these are specifically all of the quote-unquote history plays collected as so in the first folio in 1623. This first folio book publication was published 7 years after Shakespeare's death, and this is the first time we get most of Shakespeare's works printed together in one large book. Also the first time that all of his plays here are divided up into the famous categories that we all still use today, those being the comedies, the tragedies, and the histories. And again, I'll be focusing on those that were originally grouped under the first folio's histories section. Important to note here, though, for those of you who are familiar with some Shakespeare, that even though plays like Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, those plays deal with historical time periods and characters, those older Roman plays are classified as tragedies and not histories. Don't get me wrong, though, I do love those plays. I love, like, specifically Julius Caesar, but those just won't be making it onto this ranking list. So that's the brief note on the publication history. Now let's talk about the writing history and the history in the plays themselves. So in the late 1580s, 1588, 1589, and then into 1590, 1591, Shakespeare wrote his first tetralogy, a group of 4 plays, all working together like any other series you and I would read or watch today, where, it's important to have read, or back then more likely watched, the preceding entries to, have the necessary background. And based on Shakespeare's own reading and study of history, he decided to write this series about the Wars of the Roses conflict, specifically what began around Henry VI's marriage to Margaret of Anjou in 1445. And then the plays, these 4 plays, cover everything until Richard III's demise at the Battle of Bosworth Field. That's 1485, so roughly a 40-year time period is what we're looking at. So Shakespeare's retelling and dramatization of this bloody civil war between the houses of York and Lancaster, his first tetralogy, this was quite popular. And again, most audiences would be going to see these plays in and around the year 1590 or so. These 4 plays were Henry VI Part 1, Henry VI Part 2, Henry VI Part 3, and Richard III. Richard III is probably the most famous and still most widely performed today of these first 4. Anyway, after the tetralogy, or after that first tetralogy, Shakespeare apparently wanted to continue dramatizing England's history, and with one exception, all of his other history plays would chronicle events and monarchs from before the reign of Henry VI and before the War of the Roses. So in the 1590s, Shakespeare wrote a play about King John, and this is one of 2 that don't really belong to any tetralogy or series. King John would be the earliest English monarch Shakespeare wrote about, telling of the events during King John's short reign at the beginning of the 13th century. But in the mid-1590s, up until the end of the century, around the year 1600, Shakespeare wrote his most famous tetralogy and most widely praised and studied. Some call this one the Henriad. Some actually call this one the first or second Henriad, or the first or second tetralogy. And that first/second difference really comes down to, when you're talking about these plays, whether you're talking about first as in when the plays were written, or first as in when the events they're depicting actually occurred. So Shakespeare basically wrote for everyone a prequel tetralogy to his famous Wars of the Roses series that audiences were very familiar with by this time. So this new set of 4 plays included Richard II, Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, and Henry V. And these all basically chronicle England's internal conflict with the rise of the Lancaster family to the throne. Meanwhile, the 100 Years' War and other nearby rebellions kind of threaten around the borders, the periphery. I would say Henry V is probably the most well-known of all of this set of 4. However, it's not my favorite of these 4, but I do agree with most of the consensus I see out there that this set of 4 is superior to the earlier one with all the Henry VIs and Richard III. So, there we have the first 4, then King John, then the second 4, so we have 1 left to round it out at an even 10, and Shakespeare waited a good long while before writing another history play, and this next and final one was called Henry VIII, of course dramatizing a pivotal moment in Henry VIII's reign, the most recent reign now of all those Shakespeare covers, and important also to note that Henry VIII was the father of Elizabeth I, a fan of Shakespeare's, and Shakespeare was a big fan of hers. With this Henry VIII play, similar to King John, this one is very much set by itself on its own, and you'll see shortly what I think about this one. So, apologies if that was too much background, but I do often feel like with Shakespeare, it's always important to provide this sort of context when talking about his work. Without any further ado, though, let's get to the ranking. In 10th place, this is a play I've only read, and unfortunately this bottom place goes to King John. Again, I've only read this, I haven't seen any kind of production or adaptation of it, and I only read this for the first time just a few months ago. And yeah, it's fine. It has some cleverness to it, and some characters that I enjoy, but honestly, the first act is all just one really long scene, I think, that does a pretty good job setting up the succession conflict of the play. Basically, John is Richard the Lionheart's younger brother, and so he's setting himself up to inherit the throne. Other forces on the European continent want King John's nephew, and like other descendants in the line to be king instead of him. And this first scene kind of zeroes in on this one specific kind of moment where 2 brothers and their mother come to speak to the king and say, or the mother basically says, my oldest son might not actually be the son of my late husband. This might actually be a bastard child of Richard the Lionheart, and so sort of a bastard nephew of King John, and of course the younger son wants that to be true so that he can inherit the lands and property and whatever, and so King John very kind of graciously takes this bastard nephew of his into his service, and it seems like that's setting up an interesting character dynamic. I don't think Shakespeare really does much with it though, or it didn't really intrigue me what he did with it. Because the play just kind of peters out as it goes along. Again, like I said, bastard character doesn't get much to do later on. I kept feeling like I had read better versions of a lot of the scenes in this play. I had read those scenes in other plays, but done better. But done better in other plays. Quick example, there's a scene where someone goes to kill someone in the prison cell, and the prisoner is acting so kind and trying to argue why they shouldn't be killed, this sort of thing. I think there's a better version of that, a very specific better version of that in the play Richard III. And yet, so that sort of thing happens a lot in this, where, again, this play is fine. So much of it is just done far better in the other histories. Yeah, so wasn't the biggest fan of that one. And then in ninth place, this is a play that I've also only read, never seen a performance of. And again, I read this very recently. Ninth place goes to Henry VIII. So, yeah, already I've knocked out the two standalone plays out of the way, leaving only the main 8 left. But with Henry VIII, I do think there's a significant gap in quality between John and this one. This play is basically about two things. Henry trying to get an annulment for his marriage with Catherine of Aragon, and Henry's advisor Wolsey becoming too ambitious for his own good. These conflicts and scenarios kind of interweave. And the tension surrounding Wolsey's manipulations, I found that pretty interesting throughout. I especially loved the moments that pit Henry's first wife Catherine against Wolsey, as they really kind of go head to head. I think they are easily the two most complete feeling characters here, but the play does go on a bit too long for my liking after the stuff with Catherine and Wolsey is resolved. What it does in the last act or two, so much time is spent glorifying how great the marriage is between Henry and Anne, and there's so much throughout this whole play, prophecy and promises of the beautiful, amazing, best queen ever, Queen Elizabeth, who will come from this new union of Henry and Anne, and Shakespeare's love for his queen, who by this point in time, by the time he wrote this play, I believe she may have passed, but his love for her is way too on the nose here. Anyway, so yeah, that's 10th and 9th place. In 8th place, and this is a play I've both read and I also watched a TV miniseries adaptation of, and honestly, this is the one I feel like I'm not giving enough credit to, but I do feel like this play does more to support the other 3 that are in its tetralogy. It does more for those plays than it does for itself. And this is Henry IV Part 2. So it's preceded by Richard I, Henry IV Part 1, and then it's followed up by Henry V. And honestly, surrounded by such excellent plays, this one I think just kind of suffers by being one of the slower and least eventful of all of them. Also the character Hal, first the young prince and eventually Henry V. This character here is probably least interesting in this one. Of all the 3 he shows up in, I think he has to get so serious here, and I miss the same level of fun we had with him and Falstaff in Part 1, and then also we don't have quite the battles that we have of Henry V yet. By the way, that TV series I mentioned is called The Hollow Crown, and they adapted and in some cases compressed most of Shakespeare's histories. I highly recommend it. Tom Hiddleston, Loki from the MCU, he plays Prince Hal and eventually Henry V in 3 of these plays, and Jeremy Irons plays Henry IV in both Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2. But moving on, in 7th place, this is a play I've only read, and similar to Henry IV Part 2, this one I think does more to support the other plays of its respective tetralogy, but instead of being the 3rd in its series, this is actually the first one. So I'm of course talking about one of, if not the earliest of Shakespeare's histories, and this is Henry VI Part 1. And this is a weird little play, but it is a lot of fun. I hope anyone who's read it can see what I mean. It does feel very disjointed at times, but I don't mind that too much. On the one hand, you have the royals squabbling over how best to support the new young King Henry VI, and how to support him and also the English efforts in the 100 Years' War, and the recent hero and symbol for English courage and honor, a man named John Talbot. He kind of represents the common people and how important just defeating the French is in France, and how the nobility and all of their infighting, that doesn't really matter next to taking on the French. So yeah, John Talbot's sort of our hero character, but he's undermined by, on one hand, the nobility of England, and on the other hand, we'll get to that. So with the nobles, they're fighting who should send support, who shouldn't, who's trying to make whom look bad. And by the way, one of those nobles is actually going to set up a marriage for the young King Henry. Yeah. Anyway, in all of their internal feuding, the English basically lose a lot of the land and cities they had gained under the rule of the lionized Henry V, and everyone is blaming everyone else for weakening England. But another really fun element of this play is who the English are losing all of this land to. Again, this is end of the 100 Years' War, so they're fighting France. But in this play in particular, Joan of Arc has this delightfully kind of wicked run as a totally kind of mad villain, leading the French, and that's definitely fun to sort of read that interpretation. Even though I'm confident in my ranking of these bottom four, I also feel like we're now about to see a big jump up from these four to the next six, a big jump in quality. And the next six, all of them, I wouldn't be surprised if anyone picked any of these six as their favorite. They are really all so close. So, in sixth place, this is the very first history play that I ever actually read. I've seen bits and pieces of an adaptation from the 90s, and I've actually just reread this play fairly recently because, like Henry IV Part 2, I felt this one, it had been too long and that I might not be giving it enough credit. It is easily one of Shakespeare's most popular histories, and this is, of course, Richard III. A terrific play about a self-obsessed, manipulative, delusional king's kind of bloody mission to become the king, to get the crown. And while probably he's depicted more cartoonishly evil than the real king actually was, this play's lead is the best thing about it. His delusional mistreatment and misunderstandings of women, his constant stirring up of paranoia, his nonsensical and kind of his mad soliloquies, all the rest, it's wonderful. So it's definitely a good conclusion to the first tetralogy, to the Wars of the Roses series, mostly on the strength of the lead character, but at times the play does seem a bit redundant and goes on a bit too long. And I actually like the messier storylines of a few of the preceding Wars of the Roses plays. I like just the plots and more interesting characters I felt in those, more than just this really focused villain character study that is Richard III. So yeah, I'll put Richard III 6th place. In 5th place, I've read this once and watched the Hollow Crown adaptation, and fittingly we have here Henry V, the conclusion to the last tetralogy Shakespeare wrote. And if Richard III isn't the Bard's most popular history, then this one sure is. This is the battle play, the anti-French propaganda play, the one Kenneth Branagh, Laurence Olivier, and many others have adapted and reinterpreted countless times. At the center of the play, you basically have a protagonist accepting his responsibility to England and to the crown. He's the new king, and pretty quickly he's trying to take the fighting all back to France to continue and hopefully end the 100 Years' War. Is Henry a war hero, warmonger, nationalist, so on, these questions, these interesting conversations to be had around this one. The play gets you thinking about all of these different sorts of things. And definitely there's some fun ways to compare the young Prince Hal from earlier plays to the hardened yet still amiable and charming hero king of this one. Really good stuff and a fine conclusion to what I think is the superior tetralogy. I just find 4 of the other plays, history plays, more interesting than this one. In 4th place, now I've only ever read This one, and I only read it once, but it is some of the best dark comedy I think we get in any of these histories. And this is the bloody affair that is Henry VI, Part 2. So, whereas Henry was young in Part 1, um, or so whereas Henry was young, just married in the first part, and Talbot was fighting Joan and squabbling nobles, lost a ton of land in France, this one, Henry VI Part 2, brings the Wars of the Roses epic back to England entirely, and there are some delightful arguments here between those who support the Lancastrian Henry the Sixth's claim to the throne, the Red Roses, and on the other side, those who are plotting ways to turn the nobility and various factions against the House of Lancaster and in favor of the House of York, the White Roses. So when you hear how something like Martin's A Game of Thrones was based on the Wars of the Roses, it's in a play like Henry VI Part 2, and Part 3 for that matter, but it's in these plays where I think you can really see how, or a lot of those similarities. And this is basically a play all about the horrible ways a ton of people keep dying, scene after scene. If not, maybe not every scene, maybe not even every other scene, but at least once per act, you get a major character death, or characters exiled or gotten rid of in some horrible way. And some of these characters' fates are kind of so sudden and upsetting that it's almost humorous. And the best part of this play is how Richard, Duke of York, kind of the puppet master behind the scenes. So Duke of York, mostly just referred to as York in the play, he's scheming in the background. Part of his schemes include a brilliant and hilarious peasant rebellion that basically takes up the entire fourth act. This is Jack Cade's rebellion, with York pulling the strings eventually, so that he can come in and save England from Jack Cade and his rebels. And this whole fourth act helps bump this relentless little play up a few spots on my list, finding itself neatly here in fourth. And then in third place, I've also only read this once, and I've never seen it, but it follows on immediately from Henry VI Part 2, so here in third we have Henry VI Part 3. It was a bit of a toss-up for me which of the Henry VI I liked best, but I think the finality and the constant battles and warfare of this one give it the edge, the slight edge. Also, this is the play in which I think Henry VI himself gets the most to do, and this play raises the most interesting questions about what is a good king for England, or at least the most questions and considerations on this theme compared to the rest of this tetralogy. The other tetralogy might tackle those questions in more interesting ways. But anyway, there's also this play has this great scene depicting literally fathers and sons having killed each other, and Margaret, Henry's wife, she's on fire here. She really gets to shine. I love it. Also, I really like getting more of York's children, or Richard, Duke of York. His children are Edward, Clarence, and Richard, two of them eventually kings, and seeing how all of them interact with one another and kind of scheme throughout the play. Richard III's rise to, or Richard of Gloucester at this time, his kind of rise to villainy and his violent nature, all really, really great stuff. And maybe this is the most exciting of all these histories, but I do, however, find two of the other plays much richer in theme work and more compellingly constructed from a narrative standpoint, also with a few more standout characters. So in second place, and these top two are actually both plays I've read and watched the Hollow Crown adaptations of, and these are really difficult for me to choose between, but I think right now I'm going to say that second place goes to Mr. Richard II, the first chronologically in the main sequence of 8, or the 2 tetralogies. For anyone looking to get into the Shakespeare's Histories, I definitely recommend this as a great starting point. Beyond that, though, Richard II, quote, "For heaven's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings." That's from Act 3, Scene 2, I believe. And, oh boy, this is a really sad story about the death of a king. Yeah, but it's sad in a slightly unusual way. It's not like we're sad to see such a great king deposed and imprisoned by absolute villains. On the contrary, actually, I think a lot of audiences can understand the dislike of Richard. It's more sad in the way in the way that Richard II spends a lot of the play pretty blind to how he's hurt England. He's kind of like, oh, I'm just doing my best, ruling with absolute might. Some maybe would call that a tyrant, but I'm God's chosen king, and that's that. What can you do? Of course, there's probably a lot Richard could have done differently. And, especially considering how disgruntled the common people were, but also how frightened and paranoid he was making, and frustrated he was making the nobles around him and his own family members around him. And then the play really starts to hit me hard when when Richard, towards the end, he does eventually start realizing how trapped he kind of is as, on one hand, God's chosen king, but also the people's hated king. And he really internalizes this conflict, and he doesn't really know what to do or how to get out of this horrible, conflicting situation. And of course, he's starting to think, and a lot of the other characters are thinking, is this because he's actually a weak king? Or maybe he's just weaker or not as good as his father would have been had he lived long enough to be king, or as his father, or as his grandfather was as king. Just really fun questions, or not fun, but fascinating questions raised by this play, especially the end of it. And there's also some beautiful language here too, especially Richard, again, near the end. Just some really great stuff. But then, in first place, and sequentially the one right after Richard II, we of course have the only one left, and that is Henry IV, Part 1. I immediately fell in love with the characters here, especially the young Prince Hal, but also his annoying and rude friend Falstaff, and also the antagonist of this play, Hotspur. If Richard II introduces the questions around what makes a good king good, then Henry IV, I think, dives further or much deeper into exploring those ideas. I think of all 10 of these plays, this one has the best balance of comedy, violence, wit, and kind of thought-provoking soliloquies. No scene overstays its welcome, and the play moves along at a really nice pace. At the center of the play, or at least what I loved most about it, is you have a young prince being forced to confront how serious the business of being a king has to be in doing things like suppressing rebellions. But Prince Hal, he still wants to spend time with his friends, just drink, just be a man of the people, even though it's presented as a bit of an internal conflict in this play. There's these really compelling hints all throughout about how Hal trying to balance these opposite parts of his life, how that conflict is going to make him eventually one of England's best kings, or at least according to Shakespeare, one of England's best kings. But there you have it, 10 Shakespeare history plays ranked, at least 8 of which are good to great, the other 2 being fine at best. But if you're a fan of English history, the 100 Years' War, the Wars of the Roses, any and or all of that, please check out these plays. You definitely won't be disappointed. Also, if you're a fan of historical fiction, that's basically what these are, so it might be worthwhile to go back and read some historical fiction from the 16th century to look at a slightly stranger, earlier form of the genre. I'd recommend either starting with Henry VI Part 1 if you want to read these in the order Shakespeare wrote them, or starting with Richard II if you want to read these in the order in which the historical events actually took place. And definitely it's worth your while to read through all 8 that comprise that the 2 tetralogies, or that are the 2 tetralogies put together, and then, if you're a completionist and you want to have read all 10 histories, you can throw in King John and Henry VIII whenever you feel like it, really. I find the Folger's Library editions to be very approachable, I find the Folgers Library editions to be very approachable. I also believe most, if not all, of these can be found online, and I've watched most of the BBC's The Hollow Crown series, which depicts, for the most part, the two tetralogies. That's a great way to be introduced here, and you'll see some familiar faces with the actors in that. I've also been looking into a 15-episode mini-series from the 1960s called An Age of Kings. I really want to check these out. Please let me know if you're more familiar with that series and if you think I'd like it. And I'll probably start watching recordings of more stage productions of these plays too. I just really want a fuller understanding of them, and I want to see what performers can do with some characters and/or scenes that I may have otherwise forgotten about or not be remembering as well. There are numerous ways to consume Shakespeare, and my ranking today could very well be influenced by the ways in which I found these plays, mostly through reading them. So the more exposure I get to the different performances and versions, I may need to come back in a few months with an updated ranking. And if you're a fan of Shakespeare or looking to get more into his histories, I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, and whatever else down below. All that said, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye.